In a dust-beaten corner of the frontier, just after a brutal dawn ambush, a quiet cavalry scout named Mara Keene watched her commander drag from his horse with a gun to his head. Every other soldier froze, unsure if they were witnessing their leader's last breath. But Mara didn't. She broke cover alone, risking her life and her rank to fire a single shot that saved him. While searching the battleground, she found something no one else noticed, a blood-stained leather map marked with forbidden paths and symbol from a past she never spoke about. Following it meant defying orders. Ignoring it meant hundreds of innocent settlers would be slaughtered before nightfall. She chose to act. What she didn't know was that her decision would expose a hidden war, cost a young enemy fighter his life, and turn her into the unlikely hero of a story no history book would ever tell. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Heat still clung to the dust-choked pass when dawn split the sky with a thin blade of pale gold, and the cavalry scouts knew something was wrong before the first shout rose from the ridge. Hooves thundered down the slope, loose stones rattling like dry bones as enemy riders swept out of the haze in a sudden, crushing wave. Within seconds, the unit commander was torn from his saddle, dragged across the gate, and shoved to his knees with a pistol jammed against his temple. The scouts scrambled behind rock and brush, trying to form a line, but the attack had come too fast, too hard, and the man in charge looked one breath away from dying in the dust. Lieutenant Mara Keene had been ordered to hold position, to wait for clear sight lines and the signal to fire, but the sound of her commander's strangled cry tore through those rules like paper. She broke from her cover in a crouched sprint, rifle already rising to her shoulder as she slid behind a fractured boulder. The youth holding the gun, a boy no older than 17, jerked the commander closer, using him as a shield. Mara steadied her breath, squeezed the trigger, and let the shot crack through the morning. Instead of striking his heart, her bullet tore through the boy's shoulder, spinning him sideways and buying the commander a heartbeat of life. She could have ended him. She chose not to, and as the smoke drifted upward, the question hung heavy. The gunfire faded to scattered echoes against the canyon walls, leaving only the ragged breathing of men who had survived by inches. As the last enemy riders vanished into the rising sun, the cavalry scouts pulled themselves into a loose defensive ring, checking horses, counting ammunition, and steadying the shaken commander whose life had hung on the edge of a single twitch. Word traveled fast through the ranks. This ambush wasn't meant to break them. It was meant to delay them. Somewhere beyond the ridge, settlers on the move and two supply caravans were heading straight into a coordinated strike they knew nothing about. If the warning didn't reach them before nightfall, the valley could turn into a slaughterhouse. While the surgeon bound the enemy youth's shoulder, Morris searched the torn ground where the boy had fallen, half expecting to find only broken stones and boot tracks. Instead, tucked beneath a spatter of blood, she found a folded piece of weathered leather no larger than her palm. When she opened it, a map unfurled, cracked at the creases, ink faded but unmistakably deliberate. Tribal glyphs wound through narrow canyons and shadowed foothills the army had never charted. Some lines crossed known trails. Others cut through country no scout had dared mark. One symbol stopped her cold, a spiral with 3 slashes through its core. She had seen it before, burned into a shield carried by the warrior who once spared her life during a border clash years earlier. She could still remember the way he had lowered his blade, offering a single nod as if returning a debt she never understood. Now that same mark lay before her, drawn by hands that knew these lands far better than she ever would. She brought the map to the commander, explaining what it meant. The hidden paths, the breakaway faction, the threat gathering quietly beyond the ridge. But he brushed dust from his coat and dismissed her words with the weariness of a man who trusted only orders written in Washington ink. They would follow protocol. They would return to camp. Intelligence would sort the rest. Mara folded the map against her chest, feeling the weight of conscience settle heavier than command, knowing the next move demanded more than obedience. By mid-afternoon, the wind sharpened, carrying an unease that settled over the column like a darker kind of dust. 2 scouts sent ahead at first light had not returned, and the silence stretching across the pass felt thicker than the heat. The commander, jaw set and patience worn thin, ordered the men to tighten formation and prepare a defensive stand along a low ridge he believed offered cover. Mara studied the slope, the angles, the narrow funnel of ground that seemed to welcome gunfire rather than shield from it. Everything about the position felt wrong. The timing felt worse. If an attack came here, they would be boxed in with no room to maneuver, their horses trapped, their rifles half useless in the crossfire. She asked permission to sweep the northern edge alone, hoping to find some sign of the missing scouts. The commander refused, clinging to protocol as if it were a lifeline, but Mara slipped out anyway, carrying the worn leather map beneath her coat. Tracks emerged quickly, boot prints dragging, blood smudges in the grit, and one pattern she recognized, the uneven stagger of the youth she had wounded. He hadn't fled far. He had been following something, or someone. She found him slumped against a limestone outcrop, clutching his shoulder, breath ragged but eyes burning with a kind of stubborn clarity. His name was Raskin, he said, voice tight with pain. And he wasn't running from her. He was running from his own people. The ambush had been the work of a breakaway faction determined to ignite a full-scale war, one that would draw every tribe and every settler into a cycle of revenge no treaty could mend. The missing scouts, he whispered, had stumbled into the wrong ground and paid for it. And Weiss, far Weiss, hundreds of settlers and several allied tribal families were already trapped in a hidden canyon miles ahead, surrounded by fighters waiting for the sun to fall. Before she could press him further, shouts rose behind them. 3 hostile riders burst over a ridge, rifles flashing as they spotted the pair. Mara grabbed Raskin under the arm and hauled him into a run, ducking between jagged stones as bullets slapped against the rock. They escaped into a narrow cleft only she recognized, one drawn on the leather map in careful ink, a path no army officer would trust but one that might lead them to the canyon rim before the massacre began. Law demanded she return to command. Truth demanded she keep going. The campfire smoke drifted low and thin when Mara rode back into the clearing. Raskin slumped against his saddle horn, his skin pale beneath the drying blood. The men rose in alarm, hands tightening on rifle stocks, unsure whether the wounded youth was a prisoner or an omen. Mara wasted no breath. She set Raskin gently against a water barrel, unlatched her coat, and unfolded the leather map onto the commander's field table, its cracked edges trembling in the restless wind. Every line she traced came with the weight of what she had seen. Fresh tracks leading toward the hidden canyon, the silence of missing scouts, the whispered warning that hundreds were cornered with dusk closing fast. She relayed Raskin's confession word for word, letting the truth spill hard and urgent. A breakaway faction meant to trigger a war by striking civilians on both sides. But the commander's face tightened with each sentence, his distrust deepening like a shadow cutting across his features. He held the map between 2 fingers as if it were a dangerous lie. Tribal glyphs, enemy testimony, a scout acting without sanction. None of it fit the comfort of uniform regulations or the letters he kept in his coat from men far removed from the dust and blood of the frontier. He ordered Mara to stand down and prepare to return to the ridge for a tactical hold. Reinforcements would handle the rest. Raskin's words, he said, were the desperate invention of a dying boy trying to avoid the rope. No officer would gamble men's lives on it. No officer would break protocol for a rumor. Mara stared at the man she had followed for years, seeing not cruelty but fear. Fear of making the wrong call. Fear of answering to superiors who never saw the ground they wrote orders for. The men around them shifted uneasily, torn between loyalty and the unease curling through their stomachs. She tried one last time, pointing to the symbol she recognized from her own past, explaining the warrior who had once spared her, the meaning in the ink that no enemy would casually mimic. But the commander slammed the map down flat and declared the discussion over. Behind them, Raskin struggled to his feet, gripping the table edge to keep from falling. His voice was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the camp with a clarity that silenced every man present. He said he could guide them through a narrow ravine no army scout had ever walked, a shortcut to the canyon rim before night sealed the settler's fate. He didn't beg. He didn't justify. He simply offered the truth he had risked everything to share. Mara felt the moment hanging like a held breath, the air charged with the raw divide between duty and humanity. She looked out at the distant ridge where smoke from cooking fires curled upward, knowing that by the time reinforcements arrived, it would be funeral smoke rising instead. She thought of the children in those caravans, the allied families trapped beside them, the impossible cost of doing nothing. Then she asked the question that had been burning inside her since dawn, a question meant not only for herself but for anyone listening now or years from now. Would you break orders to save people who may never know your name? When no one answered, the silence became her permission. She slung her carbine across her shoulder, took up the map, and stepped to Raskin's side. Without another word, they slipped beyond the circle of firelight and into the approaching dusk, choosing a path marked not by orders but by the lives still waiting to be saved. The canyon opened beneath Mara like a vast, breathless wound in the earth, its rim jagged with stone spires and wind-carved shelves. Night had almost settled, but the last streaks of dusk gave her just enough light to see the danger below. Fires burning in a ring, shadows of armed riders pacing the perimeter, and in the center a cluster of wagons and trembling silhouettes pressed together for protection. Raskin leaned heavily against a rock beside her, his voice thin but steady as he pointed out the weakest part of the encirclement. If they struck there, quiet and fast, the confusion might be enough to pry open a path for escape. Mara moved first. She descended the stone face like a ghost, slipping between brush and fractured ledges, the worn leather map tucked at her hip. She used the canyon's natural echoes, firing single shots that ricocheted from unexpected angles, making the breakaway warriors believe a full unit was closing in from multiple sides. Horses reared, riders shouted conflicting orders, and the ring wavered. Mara's next shot shattered a lantern perched on a crate, plunging half the encampment into darkness and giving the settlers their opening. Raskin signaled them with a trembling arm, guiding the first families toward the narrow ravine he had described. Children scrambled over the rocks, clinging to their parents' hands, while older men pushed wounded companions forward. Mara kept firing, never wasteful, never wild, each shot placed to sever pursuit without taking more lives than necessary. Then, through the chaos, thunder rolled across the canyon rim. The commander's column appeared, not with hesitation but with the urgent resolve of a man who had finally seen the truth for himself. He had followed the smoke, the distant gunfire, and the unmistakable sight of civilians fleeing under cover of a lone carbine's rhythm. Now he led reinforcements into the fray, driving the attackers back with a force that broke the last threads of their formation. Just as the final families neared the ravine entrance, a stray bullet tore through the night and struck Raskin squarely in the chest. He collapsed without a sound. Mara dropped beside him, pressing her hand over the wound, but the life was already slipping from his eyes. He managed a faint smile, one that held neither regret nor fear, only relief that the war he dreaded might die with him, not be born from his people's mistakes. When the fighting ended, survivors gathered around Mara, touching her shoulders, thanking her with trembling voices, pulling her into embraces heavy with gratitude. No proclamation was needed, no official vindication delivered. The truth lived in the faces of those who walked out of that canyon alive and in the commander's silent nod as he met her gaze, acknowledging at last the courage he had refused to see. Sunset laid a copper glow across the canyon as Mara knelt beside Raskin's burial cairn, the wind tugging at her sleeves like a quiet farewell. She placed the worn leather map atop the stones, its edges darkened with his blood, and let her hand rest there long enough to honor the youth who had chosen peace when violence seemed easier. The silence felt like a promise that his final act would not be forgotten. Months later, word spread of a modest ceremony behind the garrison walls, where Mara received a commendation that never reached the papers. She accepted it with steady grace, knowing the real legacy lived in the treaty path now forming from the markings Raskin had entrusted to her. Tribal leaders and cavalry officers traced those lines together, shaping a route through lands once feared. Years passed. On a crisp autumn morning, Mara guided young scouts through the same ravine that had given so many a chance to live. She taught them to listen to the land, to trust courage over caution when others' fates hung in the balance. Courage, she told them, was often disobeying fear, not orders. Watch the next story of an unsung frontier hero.